The last 10 years we went from a small warlord state in a destroyed Russia to a united Russia that is not only much richer but also much freer. And all thanks to Shukshin and his democratic reforms who fully transformed our nation. However, all of Russia isn't free. In our west, more than 50 million Russians are being oppressed and enslaved by the German Einheitspact and its evil corporations who are so evil they can't even be compared to ours. The same in the east, where Vladivostok lie in the hands of the Japanese Empire and its Manchurian puppet regime. But our duty extends beyond simply liberating all Russians. We must also once again become the guardian of Eurasia. Because it isn't only Russians who are being oppressed. Everyone from the Baltics to Turkmenistan has been forcefully put under German boots. And thus our work begins. Using the heightened tax revenue from our previously powerful corporations, we will once again begin to raise our army expenditures. Then to organize the future sphere of liberation and maybe get other nations to join our fight, we formed the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But just because of this, we can't strike down the Germans, we need to start with easier targets. The first being our southern neighbor, Kazakhstan. While the nation was for a long time under turmoil, it has now been stabilized and united under the Kazakh Socialist Republic, a nation who firmly stands against us. They are not only hardline communists, but also Kazakh nationalists, and thus, while it would have been favorable to extend an olive branch and subjugate them through investments, this is not possible. Instead, the Ministry of Defense has concluded that a full-scale invasion is the only thing that could secure our interests in the region. The army quickly received the order to prepare the troops, and our 2,000-strong air force has also mobilized to strike the enemy before the battle even starts. And so Operation Perovsky has started. The plan is to attack everywhere with our infantry, but focus especially on reaching the Aral Sea to cut the western part of the country from their rest, and on reaching their capital to end the war faster. With no reaction from any nation except some irrelevant communist nations, we declared war and started to march south. Every single battle that was initiated was almost immediately won, as we not only caught them strangely by surprise, but their forces are simply too weak to resist ours. This allowed us to reach the Aral Sea quite quickly, despite the horrible supply we faced in this barren land. Just as planned, a huge part of their army was now encircled, allowing us to focus more on our second objective. Our motorized units had already reached halfway there, so we pushed them on, and despite it taking some weeks, it didn't feel like a long time, since no resistance was met. Not even once we reached Alma-Ata. However, despite their capital falling so easily, they didn't surrender, and we had to continue our offensive, focusing on the western encirclement, which had now turned into their stronghold. But just because it was a stronghold doesn't mean it was strong. And thus, only about 2 weeks later, we reached Aktau, leading to the capitulation of all Kazakh forces. We immediately started negotiations in Novosibirsk, and after only about 10 days we had come to a satisfying conclusion. Integrating these lands was never our goal, and it will never work due to the nationalism that has made its way into every Kazakh's heart. Instead, we decided to establish a provisional government whose goal it is to spread democracy in the nation, and they will of course be a part of the CSTO. However, just because Kazakhstan is now our ally doesn't mean our influence in Central Asia has reached its end. We must secure Turkestan as well, an ally of the Germans. Fortunately, they are so far away from Germany that the Germans aren't ready to do anything to protect the dictatorial nation, meaning we can declare war and conquer it. Despite their best attempts to try and utilize the rough terrain to their advantage and create a guerrilla defense, their forces stood no chance. Not only do we know how to fight in this type of terrain, but we are so much more equipped that the whole nation was quickly put under our control. During this short time we had looked to the northwest, to our lost lands of Karelia. While we of course didn't declare war, we did reinstate our claims and at least partially prepared for it. But now that Turkestan is captured, we must deal with the region. Just like in Kazakhstan, we established a friendly government, only this time it was split into 4 different nations. However, we aren't done, we still hold claims that are occupied by the graveyard of empires. Fortunately, no one is crazy enough to enforce these claims, and we have instead reached out to the Afghani government to surrender them, remend our relations, and even sign a non-aggression pact with them. During these talks, we also started investing into Central Asia, because otherwise our provisional governments would never be accepted by the local population. The first huge investment was to construct a railway line from Novosibirsk through Kazakhstan all the way to Samarkand. We also started developing several cities, most notably Tashkent, which will be restored as the true capital of the region. Looking back to Finland, Operation Nystad, the liberation of Karelia and Murmansk, is ready. Our army stands on the border with a part of it ready to defend against any smaller German retaliation, and our air force is prepared to establish air superiority over the whole country. We even have some tactical bombers who will hopefully bring the war to mainland Finland to end it much faster. So we cross the border into our rightful Russian land. After capturing all our claims, advancing into their mainland, and with no way for them to stop a march on Helsinki, they agreed to surrender all our claims to us in return for peace, of course. We more than gladly accepted and immediately started the process to integrate all the most northern states. During this war, two other great news had reached us. The first was that our efforts in Central Asia were more than successful, with the 5 provisional governments gaining a lot of legitimacy and stability returning to the region. The second was that our so far secret plan to solve the issue of Vladivostok has been going great. While we for a long time thought we would have to go to war with Japan to restore our Russian rule in the area, this is hopefully not necessary anymore now that our Russian Federation is united and strong. In order not to escalate it into war, we have done 2 things. The first is to intimidate the Japanese and scare them from war, mainly by holding military marches in our capital. And the most recent one was the scariest for them, because we showed off our first ever tank divisions, equipped with our modern main battle tank, the T-72. The second has been to help out the local Russian partisans, who for a long time have irritated the Manchu and Japanese rule. But now with our help, it isn't simply an irritation, it's a full-scale uprising. And it's in this situation that the Japanese have been forced to the negotiation table. The first issue is that of Birobidzhan, which will also be the easiest to win, since this is the area that has stayed the most Russian. But we still have to fight on the negotiation table. To grow our leverage, we have continued supporting the partisans and met with the Japanese to further convince them to give up the land. Of course, the Japanese tried to counter us by, for example, enticing our corporations, but these efforts were not sufficient, and the negotiation together with the region was won by our diplomats. They immediately started to prepare for the next round that regarded Primorsky Krai, which will be a lot harder. However, we are confident that our diplomats will succeed. And while they work, Shukshin, together with all military leaders, have had a meeting to prepare the final stage of our liberations. The war against Germany. The exact plans will be discussed later, but we've already started to prepare for them. And the first step is to infiltrate the Paktkommission Rusland, using everything we have learned from supporting the partisans in Japan. Our operations were actually so successful that we've already been able to cripple their army. However, it doesn't really matter, since the real threat is the Heer. Back to the negotiations, our diplomats have used all means necessary to try to win them. We've not only supported partisans and invested money, but we have pled the Americans for help and even performed naval exercises to show some teeth against the far superior Japanese navy. As the negotiations came to a halt, we sadly found ourselves stuck despite our higher leverage. This was because, unlike Birobidzhan, they want to keep Primorsky Krai. Fortunately, they were still up to negotiations, where we had to grant them painful concessions to gain the territory. Mainly that they could keep the resource rights in the area and gain access to the tungsten reserves in Magadan. So now there is only one thing left, Vladivostok itself. Once again we tried everything to higher our leverage, but just like last time it wasn't enough and we had to make concessions. This time it was to allow a safe passage for the Japanese and Chinese citizens to return home, and also a lot more resource rights to the Japanese, most notably our oil in Magadan, Chita and Amur. However, after this, all our objectives in these negotiations were won, and we signed a treaty with the Japanese, creating the Far Eastern Reintegration Zone to slowly but surely integrate the area into our lands. So this means only the German occupation is left to deal with. And we've already escalated our preparations, constructing forts all along our border with Moscovian and coastal forts against the Barents Sea to ensure that no German naval invasions land on our northern flank. We also constructed several air bases for our growing air force. While we can't be fully sure, it might be comparable to the German, all thanks to the Central Design Bureau. During all this time, we had also expanded our army to a force of 1 million men, which includes 6 tank divisions. So the war is coming ever so closely, which means it's time to draw up the final plans. We will try to learn as much as possible from Operation Barbarossa, which means creating our own blitzkrieg. We will of course advance everywhere on the front, but our main focus will be Moscow, where our elite infantry and tank divisions will launch a 2-pronged attack. The last thing we did was to mobilize the Federation and send a strongly worded letter to the Reich condemning all and everything they've done. And then finally, after years of occupation, the last struggle began for the liberation of all Russians. Operation Bargation has started. We immediately launched our planned attacks, and while only about half of the initiated battles were winning, they didn't have enough units mobilized to fill the whole front, which allowed us to advance nonetheless. It was in the center where we saw the most success, since our tank divisions managed to encircle the local defenses, as they were too concentrated in one area, and as they were destroyed, the road to Moscow was open. It was only once we arrived closer to the city where we once again met resistance, but these defenses were so unorganized that our tanks could quickly break through and liberate our previous capital. Together with a similar encirclement in the north and advances in the south, the war has started great, especially as we realized that our air force was far stronger than the German. After years of no war and complete supremacy over Europe, they have forgotten to invest into it. This has led to them already growing exhausted of the war, but not much, and we need to keep up our momentum if we want it to continue to grow. So we continued our offensives, firstly by securing all of Moskva region, which allowed us to send our elite infantry north and half of our tank force south. The southern attack was the one we focused on the most, since if everything went perfect, we might be able to cut off the German supply of oil. The first step was to reach Volgograd. Despite some defenses being set up, our motorized divisions, followed by our tanks, quickly encircled them, opening up the road to the city. It was soon captured, allowing us to continue further south, where the next goal was to reach the Caucasus, which we blew out of the water. Because we didn't only capture all the southern Moscovian cities like Elitsa and Astrakhan, but also the Caucasus cities like Stavropol and Sochi, splitting the Reich's protectorate from the rest of the Reich. Since the offensive was so successful, we had gotten further orders to completely capitulate the Reich's protectorate Caucasia. Due to almost no Caucasian units being present, all their major cities were entered without issue. The only real battle that popped up was one in Tbilisi, their capital, but with no connections to the outside world, it still fell rather quickly, leading to the capitulation of the Reich's protectorate and the liberation of all its territories. It had however led to us losing our momentum in the other areas of the front, as we had focused too much on the south. Fortunately, with German war exhaustion only rising now that they are running out of oil, us commencing increased resistance activities in all of Moscovia, and casualties for the Reichspakt rising far above ours, we will be able to restart our major offensive. Its main focus was in St. Petersburg, where our elite infantry were located. Just like in the south, there weren't many enemy forces, so the city was soon captured. During this offensive, we had also advanced in the center, capturing for example Smolensk. The Germans had tried to stage a naval invasion in Murmansk, but with it fortified, the 4 British divisions are about to get destroyed. This additional loss, together with German war exhaustion rising, has led to them offering all of Moscovian in return for peace. But this isn't our goal. We will liberate all of Eastern Europe from Germany, And since this offer shows that the Germans are desperate, we only picked up speed on our offensive. With tensions rising every single day, especially after we reached Germany with the capture of Memel, the war has become unsustainable. Since going further into Germany would result in a certain nuclear war, we will instead reach out to the German government to try to negotiate peace. While they did accept, we quickly realized that we wouldn't be able to gain what we wanted without first liberating Ukraine and dealing with the invasion of Caucasia. Because in Caucasia they had managed to take back almost all of it. Fortunately, a campaign has already started to push them out, and while we do, we can also secure the rest of Ukraine, hopefully in time for our war exhaustion not to rise over 50%. Since the Caucasus campaign was the hardest, we focused the most here. With most our tanks already in the area, sending in our elite infantry will hopefully be enough to win. And it was, however it took a long time as we had to split the enemy forces from each other to try and defeat them one by one. All the while Iran supplied the forces not encircled. But after more than a few months, the Caucasus was once again under our control. And since it had taken so long, the advances in the west had already ended. We even had the time to enter and capitulate Poland. So the Germans have now finally realized that this war is over for them, especially since plenty of other nations have started supporting us, including the Americans and Italians. And so they were basically forced to accept our terms. Everything from Riga and St. Petersburg to Sevastopol and Baku will be freed from the Einheitspact, and reconstruction authorities will be established under our control. So after decades of humiliation, Russia has finally triumphed. Victory Day has arrived. But the work ahead of us is still massive, and it all begins with the reconstruction of Moskva. We will, for example, restore historical landmarks that the Germans destroyed and help the Reconstruction Authority modernize its reconstruction equipment. However, we can't continue to the rest of former Moscovian before we have dealt with the Germans. The German army has of course been kicked out a long time ago, but fanatic Nazi settlers are still present, and without their resistance gone, we can't do anything. So we will do everything to eradicate them, sending in our special forces, expanding our intelligence presence, and even bombing their bases from the sky. While we waited for its success, we could still start rebuilding the heart of Russia, the previous Moscovian lands. This was done multiple ways. Just like we had done in Moskva, several other cities were rebuilt, which also led to significant investment arriving from Japanese, American and Italian investors wanting to take part of the Russian dream. But cities weren't everything. We also helped the rural Muscovites to recover and provide them with new opportunities. All this, together with the Nazi resistance being destroyed in one final strike, has led to an economic miracle. It might seem impossible, but with more and more investments arriving, it all makes sense. However, economy alone won't heal our old lands. It is actually the Germanification that is the biggest problem. Thus, we immediately started reintroducing Russian and the Cyrillic alphabet before the regions speak German forever. We will also start reintroducing Russian culture that has mostly been lost by the Muscovite population. And a big part of this culture is of course our newly found democratic spirit. Fortunately, they were quick to show their enthusiasm, and we could already begin local elections. Which means that Western Russia is ready for integration, just like Vladivostok, which was integrated shortly after the war. So, for the first time in what feels like several lifetimes, all of Russia is united. All except St. Petersburg, who have had a much harder time de-Germanizing. However, the motherland is still basically united, which means that Moscow can once again become the capital of Russia. But the reconstruction era isn't over. All the most western states, including Caucasia, must be rebuilt, and the German settlers who occupy our lands must still be dealt with. Starting with Gotland and St. Petersburg, both regions will be fully integrated back into Russia and Ukraine. The Volga Germans, on the other hand, will receive some autonomy since they aren't true Nazi settlers. However, all the rest will be deported back to Germany, whether they want it or not. And so we could start reconstructing the rest of the former Einheitspact lands, starting with the Caucasus, which had been deeply scarred by the Nazis and Himmelrights. However, freedom has now arrived to the area, and with investments both into the oil fields and their cities, reconstruction was quickly achieved, and the future of the region can be decided. We chose to restore the borders of the previous Soviet SSRs, which means independence for Georgia and Azerbaijan, of course in our sphere. Next up, Belarus, which followed the same pattern as the rest. However, we didn't follow the USSR this time. Instead, Belarus was integrated as an autonomous republic in our federation. Then came the Baltics, where Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were rebuilt separately, which led to them being split into 3 client states. Last of all came Ukraine, the biggest and hardest to reconstruct. However, unlike previous Russian governments, we don't seek to Russify their region. Instead, we are here to liberate their people, and to show this we will firstly start with economic reconstruction, building roads and rebuilding their cities. Then we move to the cultural restoration, helping them find their Ukrainian identity and language. And a part of this is to retake all Ukrainian lands, because Odessa is still missing, being under the control of Romania instead. We immediately demanded the territory, but with them only willing to see the city itself, not all of Transnistria, we ordered our tanks to drive to Bucharest, which they did in a little more than a month. So instead of only getting our Ukrainian territories back, we could establish a friendly government in Romania. So Ukraine was finally rebuilt, and we could grant them their independence, only annexing Rostov. And so the era of reconstruction is over. We are instead heading into the era of solidification of our freedom. In 100 days, elections will be held for the second time in our federation. What the future holds now, no one knows, but we know that the work that we have done, which seemed impossible 17 years ago in our small warlord state, has saved millions. From Vladivostok to Tallinn, freedom truly reigns for the first time in history and stands as an inspiration to all people still living in oppression. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.